Most people, when they think about exploring, they think about climbing a mountain or hiking through the woods. But some people, they take it to a whole other level. They want to go where very few people have gone before, and they want to see things that very few people have ever seen. And I'm talking about exploring caves. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories about cave exploring that went horrifyingly wrong. We're going to talk about tight spaces, we're going to talk about the fear of being lost, and we're going to talk about the terror of not knowing what's around the next corner. Today's final story is about a terrifying freak occurrence that has never happened before or since in the history of caving. I have to warn you, it is intense to say the least, so viewer discretion is advised. In Alabama, 30 minutes east of Huntsville, there's this hiking trail that goes through the woods. It's a fairly ordinary looking trail, a little bit rocky, passes over several hills. But as you continue down this trail, these hills, they start to rise up on either side of you. And as you continue deeper into the forest, these things, they just keep growing and growing until it's almost like you're walking into the mouth of a canyon. Now, near the end of this trail, a cliff rises up in the distance, and the trail seems to end at the foot of these cliffs. If you keep walking toward this, right before the cliffs, the ground slopes down very gently. Right at this spot, you have to be extremely careful, because abruptly the slope drops into a massive 143-foot pit straight into the ground. This is the Stevens Gap Pit. It's one of 2 entrances to Stevens Gap Cave, and by far the most dangerous way to enter. On one side of the pit there's a flat edge that's decent to stand on, but the edge from the trail slopes down right into this massive opening. It'd be so easy to slip and fall right into it if you're not paying attention, and obviously with a depth of 143 feet, it is certain death if you fall in. Thankfully, this isn't the only entrance to Stevens Gap. A few dozen feet over from the pit, there is a large opening with a much gentler slope that takes you almost to the bottom. But in order to reach the true bottom, which is the pit itself, you have to wind your way down a series of damp, rocky tunnels. And as with most caves, this requires a helmet with a headlamp because of how dark it gets, even with these large openings. And thankfully as well, over the years, the cave was bought and requires a permit because it's now private property. This helps to conserve the cave and to prevent anyone from just wandering in and accidentally falling in. This is also particularly dangerous at night time when the opening is not easily distinguishable from the pathway. In August of 1997, a woman named Karen was visiting Stevens Gap to do some exploring. And like many other more experienced cavers, she intended on rappelling into the pit all the way to the bottom instead of taking the easier entrance. So she and the group she was with got to the entrance, and then they set up their rappel anchor near the edge. This is usually either by bolting into some rocks or by fixing a rope to some trees. Then she got on her harness and helmet, and at the front of her harness was her rappel device. This is a special device that allows you to feed rope through and control your descent speed. Now, for her descent of 143 feet, the rope would need to be several dozen feet longer from the anchor point, plus some additional on the entrance slack. Once everything was ready and Karen was set to go, she grabbed a hold of the rope, got to the edge of the pit, and slowly backed over the edge as she let rope through the rappel device. She took a few steps down until eventually she was suspended over nothing but air. Then she was at 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, and right around 40 feet, the rope went right through the rappel device, and Karen plummeted 100 feet to the bottom of the pit and to her death. Karen had fed the wrong rope through the rappel device. The one she grabbed was the safety line that was only 40 feet long and had no knot at the end to prevent it from going right through the rappel device. Without realizing this, the rope slipped right through her fingers and sent her to the bottom of Stevens Gap Pit. Her body was later recovered from the bottom, and tragically, she is not the only person to have died at the bottom of this cave. In fact, several incidents almost exactly like this have occurred over the past few decades. There have been a few rope breaks, equipment failures, and accidental slips, and 4 people died here between 2015 and 2019 alone. All of this at the end of this seemingly ordinary trail through the woods. In May of 1990, 5 divers all gathered in a campground near Gainesville, Florida to do some diving. That day they were actually doing something known as potholing, which is where you go from spring to spring, diving and checking out the underwater scenery. This area of Florida is perfect for that because of the sheer number of clear surface springs that are teeming with sea life. The spring they were going to explore in this campground is known as Otter Springs, which looks like any other ordinary pond. It's not very big, there are some trees going around the bank, and there's a grassy beach on the other side. What's cool about these springs, though, is that because the water is so clear and warm, there are often tons of fish and other sea life in them. And even though Otter Springs isn't a very large spring, it does go down to around 40 feet, and the water is very clear, the whole depth. After the group had gotten suited up and started exploring the water, they all descended to the bottom of the spring to check out a large crack running along the floor. In this area as well, many of these springs are either fed by or open up into a large underwater cave system. Otter Springs is one of these, and at the bottom of the 40-foot depth, there is an entrance inside of a large horizontal crack that runs along the pond floor. All 5 of them got down into this crack and saw that it opened up even further into a rocky semicircle, which tunneled off into the distance. Unfortunately, no one in this group was cave certified, so this was as far as they could safely go. In fact, this group was composed of a woman named Jackie, who was a former instructor of several of the others, brothers Ron and Alan, and then 2 friends, Chris and Ken. And other than Jackie, who had over 100 dives, and Ron, who had done 52 dives, the others had done less than 7 dives each, so definitely not enough experience to even think about going inside. But as they sat at the entrance, Jackie could see that Ken wanted to go inside. She got his attention and shook her head not to, and knowing that she was the most experienced, he gave her an okay back. Then she pointed to her gauge, because they were far enough into their dive that it was time to head back up. And then she started swimming up to the surface. But, not fully appreciating the danger, Ken still really wanted to go in the cave, which the others could tell as well, and they tried talking him out of it, but before long Ken was making his way into the tunnel. They quickly went in after him to make sure he didn't get lost, but soon enough they were all kind of enjoying it. As they swam around, checking out the different passages and showing each other the cool stuff they were seeing, they figured that when they were done, they'd simply retrace their steps and head back out, and it would be no big deal. When Jackie got to the surface and looked back down, she saw that no one had followed her, and her heart sank. Right away, she was pretty upset that they'd gone in, especially because it wasn't as simple as just going in after them. She sort of had to wait helplessly until they came back up on their own. At this point, there were still lots of bubbles coming up from the entrance, though, so she hoped they would just be in and out quickly and then come back up. Then she got out of the water and to the bank of the spring and watched the water anxiously. Inside the cave, the 4 others made their way deeper and deeper, having a blast checking out the tunnels. Then, Ron stopped for a second to look at his gauge, and as soon as he lifted his head again, all of the silt they had been kicking up everywhere caught up to him and completely blinded him. He couldn't see the walls, the ceiling, up, down, and then, without realizing it, he was hyperventilating, swimming around in a panic. He swam around frantically, bumping into the walls and the ceiling, and then more walls, all while breathing way more air than he should have been. And then, miraculously, there was light. He had somehow found his way back to the cave entrance, and he shot out of the water, gasping for air. He ripped his mask off and looked around for the others, and to his horror, they were nowhere to be found. Chapter 3, Trapped. He screamed for them, but there was no answer. The only thing he could hear was the sound of his own breathing, and the beating of his own heart. He knew that he had to do something, but he didn't know what. He was trapped. What Ron didn't know was that his three friends were experiencing their own personal hell just a few dozen yards away. They too had been disoriented by the silt cloud, and they had become separated from Ron in the confusion. They swam around blindly, hoping to find their way back to the entrance, but they only seemed to get more and more lost. As the minutes ticked by, their air supplies began to dwindle. They knew that if they didn't find a way out soon, they were going to die. Just then, Chris spotted something in the distance. It was a faint light flickering in the darkness. They swam towards it, their hearts pounding with hope. As they got closer, they realized that the light was coming from a small opening in the cave wall. They swam through the opening and found themselves in a small air-filled chamber. It was a miracle. They had found an air pocket. They took off their masks and gasped for air, their bodies trembling with relief. But their ordeal was far from over. They were still trapped in a cave with no way to contact the outside world. They had no idea if they would ever be found. They huddled together in the darkness, their minds racing. They knew that they had to stay calm if they wanted to survive. They had to conserve their energy and their air. They decided to take turns sleeping, with one person staying awake at all times to keep watch. They talked about their lives, their families, and their hopes for the future. They clung to the hope that they would be rescued. Days turned into nights. The air in the chamber grew stale and heavy. The darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. They started to lose hope. But then, just when they were about to give up, they heard something. It was a faint sound, like the sound of digging. They held their breath and listened intently. The sound grew louder. Someone was digging them out. They screamed for help, their voices echoing through the cave. A few minutes later, they saw a light. Then a hand reached through the opening in the wall. They had been rescued. Cave exploration is a dangerous activity. It's important to be prepared and to take all necessary safety precautions. If you're not careful, you could end up trapped, lost, or even dead. The three stories that we've covered today are just a small sample of the many cave exploring disasters that have occurred over the years. It's important to remember that these stories are not meant to scare you away from cave exploring altogether. Caving can be a fun and rewarding activity, but it's important to be safe. So if you're ever thinking about going cave exploring, be sure to do your research, be prepared, and most importantly, be safe.